Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. These were the opening words of the most iconic Christmas story to have been put to paper outside of the Gospels themselves. The beginning of Ebenezer Scrooge's harrowing journey in A Christmas Carol. It was through these immortal words that we have a window into the Victorian era and their perceptions of the omnipresent reality that is death. In a story about ghosts haunting an old man and their last effort to sway him from greed, death is a necessity. Yet, death itself was a common fact of life in those days, one that the Victorian audience who popularized this Charles Dickens classic were all too familiar with, a common fact that we, in the modern era, have grown distant, even though its inevitability still remains. It is this alienation that has made modern audiences ignorant of the truth and wanting an explanation. For this Christmas, I wish to bring to all an explanation of the importance of death in this carol, and how we may come to appreciate this classic as a window into the past, to the world of our ancestors who have long since passed on.
Why does everything seem to happen to me?
The importance of death in the story starts with the very first line, proclaiming the death of Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley, who was Ebenezer Scrooge's closest associate, is proclaimed dead by the narrator relaying this story to us. So dead that he is as dead as a doornail, a euphemism that our narrator postulates upon its meaning, a meaning that would even be seemingly lost to him as much as the narrator's era is lost to us. The process by which his death is described is not unlike how we understand the bureaucratic process of death. This itself is a process that predates the Victorian era, but it became standard business within the rapidly urbanizing city of London. The registry of burial being referred to is what we'd call a death certificate, a document certifying that the man being buried is the man with the identity tagged to him. This process came about as a means of preventing identity theft, to officially certify that the person is dead, and anyone claiming to be him is not, in fact, that person. This particular scene is often omitted in most adaptations of the story. The only example of it being included is that of the Disney adaptation from 2009, which opts to show Scrooge identifying and signing the death certificate for Jacob Marley prior to him being carted off. After this introduction, 7 years have passed by since Marley's death. Scrooge has remained much the same, a selfish, greedy man holding a deep-rooted contempt for the rest of the world. On Christmas Eve, he is first approached by his nephew, who invites him to his Christmas party on the following morning, an invitation that Scrooge bitterly opposes. Even in spite of his nephew's clear compassion for the old man, Scrooge shows no sign of budging, becoming overtly hostile towards him. Shortly after his parting, 2 men enter and ask for Scrooge to provide money to help the poor. In response to their request, he retorts by asking, "Are there no prisons?" and "Are there no union workhouses?" To these, they respond by pointing out their deplorable conditions, insisting that many either cannot go there or would rather die. This sentiment was not an uncommon one, as, during this time, prisons were unpleasant places to be, as exhibited by Pennsylvania State Penitentiary, while the workhouses were little better than an abusive form of indentured servitude, where the poor would often not be paid at all to live in and work for a business. To this, Scrooge expresses one of his most sincere, disheartening beliefs. "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." After being thoroughly rebuked, much like Scrooge's nephew, they end up leaving him. By evening, Scrooge would leave his money-lending office, an office that had both his and Marley's name, and make his journey home. It is here, when approaching his door, he would witness the first ghastly sight of the night. For, normally, his knocker was an unremarkable one. However, on this night, instead of it being a typical door knocker, Scrooge would encounter the face of his long-dead partner, Jacob Marley. The moment was swift, but, as with any ghostly haunting, it unnerved Scrooge. He would retreat into the house and approach the grand staircase. It was here that he swore he had seen a horse-drawn hearse going on before him, often a familiar sight in the city of London. Once he had made it to his bedchamber, a bedchamber that used to belong to his former partner. He double-locked the door and finally settled down to eat his gruel. However, the door-knocker would not be Marley's only appearance before Scrooge. His second appearance, and final appearance, would be far more personal.
It's all still a house.
Upon entering through the doorway, Scrooge is able to better discern Marley's ghastly features with greater detail, but doubting as much as possible that this was Marley standing before him. Our narrator noted, "Though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folder kerchief bound around its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses." Marley's ghost is not merely Jacob Marley. It is Jacob Marley as a form of living dead. Marley's eyes, which remain motionless throughout Scrooge's experience, are like those witnessed upon a person's death, even being described as glazed over, a phenomenon that commonly occurs to the human body upon death. Yet what is more telling is the inclusion of the handkerchief binding his chin to his head. You may be asking yourself, why is a handkerchief bound around someone's jaw attributed to death? For this, we can refer to an example, though, fair warning, the image I'll be showing you may be disturbing to some, so if you wish to skip it, I'll leave a timestamp for you to use. This is John Torrington, who died on January 18th, 1846, at the age of 20. He was one of 3 mummified remains interred on Beechey Island by the ill-fated Franklin expedition. Torrington was exhumed in an expedition conducted in 1984 to inquire further about the potential fate of the expedition's crew. What is remarkable about Torrington is the preservation of not just his body, but the clothing he wore at the time. Most notably, Torrington, much like with Marley, has the same handkerchief wrapped around his head and underneath his chin. The reason why this was done is alluded to by the narrator in the story. At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. These bandages were used to hold up the jaw of the deceased, just as eyes become glazed over upon death. The muscles that allow for us to close our mouths relax, and as a result, their mouths drop open. In order to preserve the dignity of the deceased, it was common practice for a handkerchief to be tied underneath their jaw and around their head in order to keep the deceased's mouth closed. This practice fell out of favor with the rise of the funeral home industry, which developed suturing techniques that would seamlessly close the mouth. Jacob Marley is the embodiment of death, a living death that restlessly haunts this world for his sins. The chains that bind him to this world and weigh his spirit down were ones he forged through his sin, a punishment worthy of Dante's 9-layered hell, a punishment that Ebenezer Scrooge faces, but with a burden far greater than even Marley's. However, he has a chance to escape this miserable fate, a meeting with 3 spirits who will, hopefully, redeem a man thought irredeemable. Upon giving him this harrowing message, Marley departs through the window of the bedchamber. Scrooge endeavors to follow Marley, only to witness that countless more suffer the same burden as Marley, all condemned for the same grievous sin that Scrooge is guilty of. This vision of a terrible fate is enveloped with fog, and, just as with Marley, vanishes into the cold night. Scrooge, now thoroughly disturbed, retires for the night in preparation for the entry of the first of the 3 spirits. Scrooge stirs himself awake, aware of what Marley had warned him about. It isn't long after that he encounters the first of the 3 spirits that is to visit him, the ghost of Christmas past. The spirit startles him after pulling away the bed drapes, revealing himself to be an odd-looking figure with youthful yet adult features, while his head is set ablaze in brilliant light, holding in one hand a large cone, a cone similar in shape and design to those used to snuff out candles. The spirit prompts Scrooge to grab a hold of his hand, soon taking Scrooge on a lighter-than-air journey away from his London estate and out towards the countryside, specifically to a boarding school. There he is confronted with the visions of his past, seeing many of his schoolmates only to confront himself, sitting alone in the boarding school. Many months, possibly several years, pass by before his stay at this oppressive boarding school is finally ended. Little Fan, his younger sister, greets Scrooge with good news that their father had a change of heart and wished for him to return home, bringing to Scrooge a sense of joy in his life. Yet these happy memories end up being tainted with the grim reality of death. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she had," cried Scrooge. "You're right. I'm not gainsay it, Spirit, God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." After this bittersweet memory, Scrooge is brought back to happier times, such as his time as the apprentice of Mr. Fezziwig, who, during Christmas, would host a celebration of great jubilation and joy. Yet, from this high point, the memories become ever more dour. The spirit reminds him of the woes with his wife, a lady who came to renounce her love for him, condemning him for the greed that had taken over his heart. He was shown a vision, not distinctly his own memory, of his former wife, now with many children and a loving husband, one who discussed the circumstances of Scrooge's loneliness, and his partner, Jacob Marley, who was near the point of death. It is here that I wish to discuss the circumstances of Little Fan's death. During this time, it was not uncommon for young women to die, particularly during childbirth. It can be inferred from the story that Fan likely died as a result of the birth of her son, Scrooge's nephew. With modern medical advancements, giving birth has become less life-threatening. However, during the Victorian era, where medical advancements were quite limited, pregnancy and birthing were risky affairs for women, often carrying a considerable risk of death, as the process of giving birth is painful and exhausting, posing a greater risk of contracting diseases for the mother-to-be, in addition to potential complications while giving birth. This would, in part, explain Scrooge's attitude towards his nephew. He, whether knowingly or not, may be placing the blame of her death upon him. This, coupled with Scrooge's wife divorcing him and the death of Jacob Marley, serves as the explanation for why Scrooge became such a bitter old man, one deeply resentful of any and every form of celebration of Christmas. Scrooge, finally disturbed by all of these visions of the past, decides to snuff out the flame of his memories in the most literal fashion imaginable. He wrestles from the ghost of Christmas past the dowsing cone and forces it over the head of the spirit, snuffing out the spirit from troubling him with the memories of his past. Scrooge, thoroughly exhausted from these visions of the past, retired once more to his bed, awaiting the second spirit that was to visit him.
Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
Scrooge stirred himself awake for a second time, but this time prepared for the second spirit to appear next to his bed. However, this time he was beckoned by the spirit to come into the adjacent room. There, the second spirit would introduce himself as the ghost of Christmas present. He was a large fellow, a giant of a fellow, who sat atop a mountain of food in a well-lit room decorated in garland for Christmas. The ghost of Christmas present soon whisked him from his home, taking him through the streets of London on Christmas Day, showing him the general compassion of mankind during this day. Eventually, they both end up at a small home where the family of his clerk, Bob Cratchit, reside. We are introduced to his wife, his eldest son Peter Cratchit, Belinda Cratchit, and a younger son and daughter waiting for Bob to return from the market. When he does so, he has his youngest son, Tim, perched upon his shoulders while holding in his hand a small priced goose, which the family partake in for Christmas. However, the story spends time focusing on Tiny Tim, the youngest of the Cratchit family. He was likely born as a cripple, needing a crutch whenever he walked. In spite of his physical disability, he shares with his father and his family a genuine love for all, a love that had become deeply foreign to Scrooge for many years. It is seeing Tiny Tim that suddenly provokes Scrooge to ask the spirit of his fate. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." This is the tragedy of the Victorian era. With the rapid advancement of industry and the increase in population, many, including Scrooge himself, came to view people more as a nuisance than as living, breathing human beings. Yet the view that the spirit echoed from Scrooge's own words would become the foundation for the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche later on in the century, becoming the groundwork for profound human suffering in the following century. More so to the point, it is important to remember that mortality rates among children were quite high. This had been a trend that was common throughout human history. Most people were likely to die within the first year or two of their lives. In Tiny Tim's case, he was lucky to have been able to live beyond infancy, especially with his physical disability. The narrator of the story doesn't elaborate on how Tim dies, but it can be deduced from the era that it was likely some form of disease. Diseases, such as measles or mumps, could be quite lethal. Given Tiny Tim's physical ailments and living in poor conditions, it would have compounded such diseases and likely led to his death if no intervention from others were to take place. From here, the spirit takes Scrooge to see his nephew's party, a party Scrooge comes to realize he truly does want to participate in. Yet here, and at the Cratchit house, it is shown that Scrooge is viewed with scorn by most, though Bob and Scrooge's nephew still do care about him. From there, Scrooge is shown countless people and countless places around the world, celebrating Christmas or longing to return home to celebrate that day. Yet, Scrooge observes a change in the spirit. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older, Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight, at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." Much as with Scrooge or any one of us, the spirit has a finite amount of time upon this world. Much like with us, he lives, he grows old, and finally passes on. But before the spirit finally departs, he provides to Scrooge one final lesson. From underneath his robes, he reveals 2 decrepit children, without much of any flesh upon them. The spirit reveals to Scrooge what these 2 are. The boy is ignorance, and the girl is want. He urges Scrooge to beware them both, but ignorance most of all, as doom is ascribed specifically to him. Before the spirit departs, he pleads with the spirit. "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" With the spirit feeding Scrooge his own words, he departs upon the stroke of midnight, leaving Scrooge to tackle the final spirit that is to visit him. It is not long after that Scrooge encounters the final spirit, the most unsettling, grim spirit of the 3. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knees. For the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. It is apparent from the onset that this final spirit is meant to be the embodiment of death. Throughout the final part, the spirit says nothing, almost as silent as the grave itself. It breathes a future of gathering gloom, of desolation and death. This the spirit delivers. He soon leads Scrooge to the streets where the businessmen that Scrooge knew, were astir over the passing of a man, one who was viewed with contempt or flat-out indifference. Some even proposed going to the funeral, though one retorted that he wouldn't go unless if they had food available afterwards. The spirit soon led him towards a part of town he'd never been to, showing an old man named Old Joe meeting with two women and another man, specifically an undertaker. It is soon revealed to Scrooge that these three people had been at the deceased man's home and had, in their diabolical hearts, robbed from the duly departed man. They had taken from the home sleeve buttons, brooches, his clothes, and even the bed curtains and blankets while the deceased man was still lying in his bed. This scene and its implications deeply disgusted and horrified Scrooge. Yet, during this era, such mortifying acts were not unheard of, nor were they as simple as this. This time was witness to a phenomenon we aren't accustomed to, but was a serious issue. Body snatching. It was not uncommon for people lacking particular moral scruples to go to a local cemetery, find a freshly buried person, exhume them, and then sell their bodies to the local medical college for a fair penny. This was a common issue on both sides of the Atlantic, becoming such a prolific issue that more wealthy clients would take to finding solutions against such an event. This included encasing their grave with an iron fence in order to deter people from taking their remains. It was this exact issue that led to the passage of laws forbidding people from selling bodies or organs to medical institutions. In Scrooge's case, he was lucky it was only his bed curtains and blankets that were taken. Scrooge is then shown the deceased man, still lying in a now curtainless bed with only a sheet covering his face. He was truly alone, with not a soul to remember him in any way, shape, or form, while Scrooge could hear the sound of a cat tearing at the door, while rats gnawed and scratched beneath a hearthstone, trying to get into the room for reasons the narrator doesn't elaborate upon, but we, the audience, can infer upon without difficulty. It is here Scrooge implores to see if anyone cares for this man, only to be shown that the only people emotionally jolted by his death are jubilant. They were people who were indebted to the man, who, with his death, could find a creditor who would be less stringent and merciless. Scrooge then implores for the spirit to show him tenderness connected to a death, to which he is led once more to Bob Cratchit's house. Here we find the Cratchit family reminiscing about Tiny Tim before Bob returned home. When Bob finally arrives back home, he is greeted by his family and was praising his wife for the cloth they had been stitching. Then Mrs. Cratchit inquired, "Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob. "My little child." This truly heart-wrenching scene is one that many who've lost someone close to them could sympathize with. From this, we could gather that Tiny Tim has been deceased for a long while, as grass has likely grown over top of his grave. Yet, outside of this glimpse, we know little else. However, based on the meager income of the Cratchit family, it's likely that Tiny Tim, like so many others in this time, was buried in an unmarked grave, possibly in a pauper's burial ground. there would scarce be any markers seen around the place, making it look lively and green. If there are any markers, they would likely be made out of wood, some simple crosses, while others with names painted on them. Thus was the fate of many during this time, to be buried and, most tragic of all, forgotten. The spirit then leads him through town, passing by his home and his business towards the final destination. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. This was another common sight in this era. By the early Victorian era, there was a growing issue within major cities, such as London, where the cities were finding it difficult to find places to bury their dead. Many old churchyards and burial grounds had become choked with burials, often seeing multiple people buried in the same spot. This became such an issue during this era that a solution had to be conceived. This would result in the development of modern cemeteries within the city, such as Abney Park Cemetery or Highgate Cemetery. These garden cemeteries, often known as rural cemeteries, caught on throughout Europe and North America as a means of tackling with this exact problem. It is here, in this overused graveyard, that Scrooge is brought to a singular grave, which the spirit points towards, as silent as ever. Scrooge questioned the spirit whether these events were things that will occur or might occur, which the spirit responded with silence, still pointing to the stone. There, Scrooge came to finally realize that this man viewed with scorn, who died alone and had his things taken from right off his dead body, truly was. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name. Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge pled to the spirit in sorrow, fully regretting the man he had become. He promised to the spirit that he came to regret what he had become and wanted to change. His heart had truly changed. The spirit's hand, which had remained steady and certain, began to tremble at Scrooge's pleading, at the sincerity of his words. The spirit then morphed, becoming nothing more than the bedpost from his bed.
They're here. They're still here. I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still here.
Scrooge had awoken a changed man. For the first time in many years, he felt profound joy in his life and sought to right the many wrongs of that life. He ensured Bob Cratchit would receive a priced turkey from the poulterer's shop and came to visit his nephew. He found the men who had asked for him to provide a donation to help those around him, and he did so likewise. Most important of all, the following day, he gave Bob Cratchit a bonus to his pay and promised to help his struggling family. In the end, Scrooge's actions prevented Tiny Tim from dying within the year and proved to be a true redemption of the man. In the end, Scrooge's transformation from a callous, incompassionate miser towards an empathetic, generous man was morphed by the realization of his own mortality. That he, as a man with wealth and influence, could do great things for those around him, even to the degree of rendering those who would otherwise be condemned to die a new lease on life. This novella tackled the many issues prominent in this era, from the extreme economic disparity towards the ever-present reality that is our mortality, and brought about it a story of redemption, one deeply rooted in the Christian faith. It is one I would recommend all to read, to understand what we ought to be, to understand the core message of the Christian faith, to come to understand our past and what our ancestors had to endure to bring about a better society. Death may be ever present, but we can learn from it, just as Scrooge learned from it, in order to endeavor to become better men. And so, I wish for everyone to have a Merry Christmas, and, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us.